This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness. And I don't think that was too painful. I think we did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
And we are back in the dark room. I'm Brad Kelly. This is my co-host, Kevin Kautzman. Kevin, how are you this evening?
I've been good. My cult meetings have been going very well. The new
are you talking about your day job or what?
I'm talking about the other day job. We only meet at night.
Ooh. That's right.
Beneath the ruins.
How are you? Ancient from ancient tablature. I'm good, man. I'm good. You know, I got to keep my spirits buoyant to talk Lovecraft so I can survive it. Kind of gave it away. We're talking, if you clicked on this link, you probably know we're talking about Lovecraft and Faulkner, H.P. Lovecraft, William Faulkner, two great American writers. Now, for people who've been following along, you know how a dark room works. We've covered these subjects in depth on previous episodes, kind of telling the whole story about them and dipping into their work. And this is a dark room where we have a guest come on who, you know, has a perspective on, in this case, two of our subjects. And, you know, we have a slightly more informal conversation. It's almost like a breakout session. If the main episode were to be, you know, the main conference talk, this is sort of the breakout session. And we get to go a little bit deeper into specific subjects.
I like to think of these as more as like breakdown sessions. Yeah. We've had people have pulled guns. We've had, I've stormed off the set. One antique gun.
I don't even think they make ammunition for that gun anymore.
Oh, but he does. Aaron Gwynn does. You want to introduce our guest?
Yes, I'm very excited. Yes. So we've brought David Leo Rice, writer, co-host of the Wake Island podcast. Great podcast you people should check out. Kevin, what's that?
Well, and I see that David has, it looks like Pinter, a collection of Pinter's work there rather prominently displayed.
So
I have some respect. Am I correct?
Totally. He's up tomorrow for my teaching. We're doing old times.
Okay.
Cool. So he's one of my guys for sure.
Very cool. All right. Good. I like this. Just want to continue my intro of David Leo Rice, author of the Room and Dodge City trilogy. I've been plugging away at one of the volumes. Excellent. Highly recommend it. It's I don't want to say too much about it. I'm going to let David talk about it or whatever of his own work he wants to talk about, but I highly recommend the Room and Dodge City trilogy. Also the author of Angel House, and fairly recently with Chris Kelso, the book Children of the New Flesh, which is a compendium of reflections on the early work and pervasive influence of one David Cronenberg. And as I said, he is also the co-host of the Wake Island podcast. You can find him at raviddice.com. That's also his Twitter handle, at raviddice, RAVIDDICE. So thanks for your time, David. We really appreciate you coming on. I think I reached out to you just like, hey, mate, let's work together. Let's have you on for something. And I don't think we even had an idea who we were going to talk about at first. And you came back with Faulkner Lovecraft. And I was like, yes.
Yeah, it's an exciting topic.
Yeah. I mean, I've always kind of intuited a connection there. Maybe not always. I think I started to, in my sort of reintroducing myself to Lovecraft to do our original episode. And yeah, there is fertile territory there. If I can back up for a second, though, like at what point, what is your history with Lovecraft, I guess? Where did you start reading it? Maybe.
So I grew up, maybe to start even earlier than that, I grew up in Northampton, Massachusetts, Western Mass.
Oh, you're
so
like
I'm definitely a New Englander.
Yeah.
That sense of just, rotting, decaying towns was super prevalent. And also Northampton, Mass is named after Northampton, England, which is where Alan Moore lives, who is kind of one of the world's great Lovecraft scholars and reinterpreters. And I would say Moore's Providence is really one of the great things to be done with the Lovecraft world, maybe ever, but certainly recently. Mm-hmm. So that world felt super familiar to me. Yeah,
isn't that about? Isn't that about 20 miles from Amherst or so?
Less, 6 miles. So right across the river.
Okay,
yeah, so we're talking about Emily Dickinson.
I'm doing Emily.
Right in the mix.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm starting to think about Lovecraft. You know how they did Jane? What was it? Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. I'm thinking about like some more sophisticated. Emily Dickinson and Lovecraft kind of mashed.
Well, because they were both kind of shut-ins and both famous letter writers, right? So it could be someone makes a discovery that they were corresponding with each other, and
something like that.
Symbols in Dickinson's poetry represented, symbols in Lovecraft's world.
Could be cool stuff. We're gonna put a copyright on that right now.
Right. When so growing up next to Amherst, in 4th grade, 5th grade, like every year they would take us to Emily Dickinson's house, which is is a museum and a site. But I feel like they never once expressed the scope of her fame. Like they introduced her as this kind of eccentric, like local poet who, lowered snacks to the kids in a basket, and then I felt like I got to college and everyone was talking about Emily Dickinson. I was like, wait, like you've heard of her too? Like
that's that woman that we know. Yeah,
exactly. She's the lady in the house, right? A very Faulknerian character too.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Very cool. So yeah, Northampton. Now, then that brings, I don't know how far that is from Providence, but it's all in the same sort of time zone. Did you get into Lovecraft like as a teenager? Because I know that's when a lot of people get into it.
Yeah. So I think Faulkner and Lovecraft. So Lovecraft, was just ubiquitous. Like he was, these kind of pulp editions were circulating. Forget who put it in my hands initially, but I can remember... I took a gap year with 3 friends before college, and I can remember being on a train in Italy reading the music of Eric Zahn, and somehow it, I found it extremely interesting, but it was like it made me homesick in a very particular way. It made me long for like what is uniquely depraved about the American spirit realm.
Interesting. Yeah.
What do you think it is that is uniquely depraved about I like this phrase. Go ahead.
I think it's something, we could start here. It's a connection, something you see in Faulkner and Lovecraft, I think, is this sense that there's the ultra new or almost like the ahistorical in the new world, that there's just like whatever's happening right now. And then the deeply ancient, like something older than recorded history. You see that in Moby Dick too, right? Of just like primal forces of nature, Cormac McCarthy. But what there isn't...
Twin Peaks,
100%, 100%.
Yeah.
But what you don't have is anything in between. You don't have sort of like the ordered recent history the way you do in Europe, right? Which makes sense that Lovecraft and Faulkner were both ambivalent, right? They kind of longed to be more English than they really were, right? And they, Lovecraft famously affected a British accent. Faulkner kind of named himself Faulkner, right? It's really
well, and
he affected an accent too, right, Brad?
Yeah, he basically pretended to be an Englishman to get into the Royal Flying Air Force in Canada and affected a British accent for months on end, right? So yeah, that is certainly something that they both tended towards. And it is funny that it does feel, and I can't quite put my finger on it because I'm a Midwesterner, right? But there is something Southern about Lovecraft a little bit. And I've always felt there. I mean, certainly New England, 100, without a doubt, but there's some tinge there, and it's very interesting.
And it's something you feel, I mean, in Northampton, partly because it's in a valley, in the Connecticut River Valley, same as Amherst. Mm-hmm. In the winter, at least when I was a kid, it became super, super snowy. But in the summer, it would steam up because of the river and the mountains that would catch it. So it would become like insanely lush. It would become almost like psychedelically overgrown. And it was actually, this is something not that many people know, Connecticut and Western Mass were big tobacco growing areas.
Oh.
Weirdly enough. So like it totally did have the Southern feel that you would pass these like barns with the tobacco growing, and it was like New Orleans half the year and Siberia the other half of the year.
Right. Very.
People really sleep on the importance of tobacco in American history. I personally do my part every single day to remember that.
Right. To pay tribute to the old gods.
Indeed I do. Yeah.
And it's and I'm glad you said pay tribute to the old gods, because it had deep spiritual importance to the native peoples who were here long before the Europeans.
It still does.
Sure. Yeah. And it's instrumental in various plant medicine traditions all over the North and South America. So to speak of tobacco as one of the old gods is, for a large number of people, is literal.
I have a fun internet schizo theory that when they pulled tobacco out of the mainstream, they did it intentionally and replaced it with the phones. I think the same energy that went, and we don't need to get into all the politics around what it meant to have a smoke break and all the rest of it, but there's a lot going on there, and you don't just totally re-engineer the culture in a 5-year span from acceptable to unacceptable without there being unanticipated consequences.
100%.
Yeah.
And also the phone, it's like about the size of a cigarette case, right? It's something you keep kind of in your pocket.
You always have it on you.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. You have to look away from the conversation to check it, but you can still be kind of talking to other people.
Right.
I see it.
Interesting.
All right.
Oh, boy.
And I think actually conspiracy mindedness is a very American thing too, which I think is related to the sense of us not being sure, not having a settled history, right? Having the idea that there's something unknown in the present tense, and then these like ancient forces that we're always afraid go deeper than we think they do.
Right. I mean, there's a sense of filling in the void, and just like when when you're a kid and you enter the dark cellar, right? Your brain, your imagination starts populating that space, that unknown space with monsters, and American history is kind of like that same process, but sort of writ large. Yeah.
And not knowing, at least from the perspective of European Americans, you're uprooted from a history in Europe that you may or may not know about, but you're uprooted from it. And then the question is, do you root yourself in something else? Whether it's, some kind of alternative view of what history is, whether it's Native American culture, whether it's, literature, or do you remain kind of rootless? And I think that's something you see in both Faulkner and Lovecraft, is the sense of grappling with the idea of history turning into hearsay, right? Both of them tell their story. There's a stylistic similarity, but both of them tell their stories through endless layers of, this person said this and this person said that, or, and Lovecraft is always, finding a letter that was by someone who died, who maybe encountered. There's always a sense that you can never get at anything firsthand, nor can you trust the recorded sources the way maybe a proper Englishman in London could, perhaps, right? But we definitely don't trust that.
No, that's very well put. I mean, Absalom, I think of, when you say that for Faulkner, I think about Absalom, which a large portion of Absalom is based on, Quentin Compson and his roommate basically speculating about the lineage and the stories and the myth of Sutpen, right? It's very much, you kind of have these hints and clues, and somebody told me this then, and somebody told my grandfather this another time, and then I heard that this happened, and then they're sort of playing with this idea until some distance through the book, you're like, well, boy, I don't know if any of this is true. And then, well, wait, actually, I'm reading a book, so none of it's true. But you know what I mean? It's sort of like there's an infinite regression, and that's I think amplification or an exaggeration of an American style of us telling our story to ourselves.
And it's a very American trade-off. You know, if you think about Sutpens or the Snopes, who are the other kind of great Faulknerian like dark power figures. Mm-hmm. You know, on the one hand, you can become larger than life, like you can become a living legend. On the other hand, it's like you're never quite real, like no one's sure what's true about you.
Right. And you can, I mean, that's one of the powers too, right? Is the American tradition of reinventing yourself, right? Mm-hmm. Which you can't do as much as you know, it's too easy to Google people now. So you can't do it to the same degree you could before.
Maybe not. I mean, how many anons have we had on this podcast, Brad? People are doing it at their desks.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
in fairness,
we're doing it in the digital realm at this point, right? Correct.
Yeah.
I've always thought that the best way to conceal your identity, if you wanted to be anonymous on the internet, is to actually sort of steal the identity of some random person. Just go on Facebook, take a couple photos of some random person from wherever and their name, and then become that person online.
I remember once, years, like in the early days of laptops, I don't know, 15 years ago, I was in the train station in Philadelphia. And for some reason, I was there in like the middle of the night, maybe waiting for a morning train. And there was this guy like on the bench next to me. And I took out my laptop and I was doing some work. And the guy kind of looks at it and he goes, you know, oh, I need to get me one of those. And I was like, oh, yeah, like, what, you know, what would you do with it? And he goes, well, I would make a new identity. And I said, well, what would you do then? And he said, I would improvise.
That's quite a moment. I love that.
And that is the sound of 1,000 people being subtweeted by that comment. Many such cases.
That's awesome.
Wow. That rocks.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
I want to think I picked up the very beginning of The Town, which is not one of Faulkner's better books, but it's the second book.
One that I've read. Yeah.
It's kind of bad. We can talk about this, but it shows how far he fell off. This one's from like the late 50s, but it's the second book in the Snopes series. And it just made me think of it the way he announces it. So on page 1, I'll skim a little, but he says literally the first line of the book is, I wasn't born yet, so it was Cousin Gowan who was there and big enough to see and remember and tell me afterward when I was big enough for it to make sense. That is, and then he lists like 7 different people who saw all this stuff. And then at the end, he says, so this, meaning the book that's going to come, is what Gowan knew about it until I got born and big enough to know about it too. So when I say we and we thought, what I mean is Jefferson and what Jefferson thought.
Whoa, right. Yeah, all kinds of ambiguities and self-referential stuff there. And you're right, this does call to mind aspects of Lovecraft. Like I'm thinking of Call of Cthulhu, which is like you know, the guy finds a thing from his uncle. Nobody's really sure what it is or what to do about it. So you check with an expert and they say it could be something like this. And it reminds them of eventually you're just sort of layering in all of these partially known storylines until the end, you know, you're left with, well, something happened.
And with Lovecraft, it's even more amazing because he, unique in maybe all modern literature, spawned his own mythos, right? He sort of like discusses and describes the Cthulhu mythos in his stories as if it already exists. Mm-hmm. And then almost in a supernatural way, it comes to exist, right? And like, you know, many people up to today have dedicated basically their entire career to expanding that mythos. Like it really does feel like he founded a new religion in a kind of shockingly powerful sense.
Wednesdays from 11:30 until 1:30 in the morning for me.
Is it? That's Cthulhu
calling
hour?
Back. Yeah. I told you. Wasn't joking.
Yeah. Well, and we had talked about in our original episode, what is that guy's name? Kenneth. There's an English occultist who literally who did an aspect of his cultic practice was to invoke the Lovecraftian gods. right? And we've seen this with Nick Land taking the old ones seriously and bringing those into his philosophy. So like, yeah, these aren't just like they've become more than a fictional conceit in a way, and certainly outlives Lovecraft himself. You had suggested, David, that you'd seen some correspondences between Faulkner and Lovecraft, specifically in the Dunwich Horror. And I reread that, and it had been a while. That's one I read years ago and hadn't read since. And with that sort of primer of like, just with Faulkner sitting on my shoulder reading that story, I couldn't stop seeing the correspondences. Honestly, like it feels like a Faulkner piece almost, right? And could you talk a little bit about how those two, Dunwich Horror and Faulkner in general, or Faulkner specifically, how do you see those two being related?
Absolutely. I think it's, you could put Dunwich Horror and Absalom, or Light in August, but maybe Absalom is the clearest example. I think you could approach it from a number of angles. So one thing to say, just very factually, that is a kind of amazing correspondence, is they wrote all their great work, including those pieces, during the exact same years, basically 1927 to 37. Lovecraft died in 37, and Faulkner, didn't die, but something in him died. Like he never quite reached that level again. It's a little sad actually to read Faulkner's later work. But anyway, so those are the years, and it's a crucial time in history, right? Because it's after World War I. They have this sense of Europe is in bad shape, right? So whatever relation they have to Europe, whatever fantasy they have about it, is complicated by the fact that it seems to be on fire. You have the beginning of something very strange happening in physics and in psychology, right? You have Einstein and Freud, who were important to both of them, even if they kind of pushed back on them, but they were very, very aware of those theories. You have the Depression in America, so the themes of degeneration and decay and things going to seed, very present within both of their works. You have eugenics around the world, right? I mean, in Germany, Japan, and America. So when you get into this idea of racial decay, or sort of, to use Faulkner's favorite word, miscegenation, you see that all throughout Lovecraft and all throughout Faulkner, especially in these works where there's this kind of obsession with something monstrous entering the gene pool, something like inhuman, or maybe something that is human, but is a kind of like abject form of humanity from the point of view of the narrator. And both these guys were racist. I mean, they were kind of white supremacists in a way that is, is well known. We don't need to out them for that. It's clear. But I think, I reread Welbeck wrote this book, Against the World, Against Life, about Lovecraft. And he made a really interesting point when he talked about, Lovecraft famously left Providence for a very brief spell, came to New York, had some kind of complete freak out at the presence of other races, basically, and then returned to Providence sort of charged up with this, like, frantic hatred that led to things like the Dunwich Horror. And Welbeck had a really good point, I think, when he said, like all true racists, Lovecraft was not primarily horrified at the existence of any given race, but at the inevitability of the mixing of races. Yeah. And that's what, so that brings us to Dunwich Horror, which really is about, this town going to seed through having a kind of dark annunciation, right? It's like the inverted Christ myth where, a virginal woman. Actually, another interesting thing to point out is the relation between incest and racial mixing. Because on the one hand, they're opposites, right? One is like degenerate from their point of view because it's too close within the gene pool, one too wide. But within a story like Dunwich, you have both, because you have like this kind of degenerating incestuous clan, in the hills outside of town, who then, you could say, to save themselves from terminal incest, one woman from that family becomes pregnant with what basically is a kind of antichrist.
Right.
And it's like the most wild
and at first, like, if you're just looking for what the implication is, there's a few pages there where it seems like she might have gotten pregnant with her own father's child, right? It's sort of like, wait, because nobody knows, and then over time you realize, like, oh, it's actually much worse than that.
That would be like letting her off the hook if that were true. Right. And that would be Faulkner, right? Faulkner's obsessed with that, lines of family crossing by basically that form of like father-daughter incest, for sure.
Well, it occurs to me now how Lovecraftian Rosemary's Baby is. And of course, you just mentioned the incest thing. That's the other great Polanski movie, Chinatown.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Yeah. I mean, and yeah.
There could be a Polanski, Polanski's touching on the same thing. And in the After Dark, we're gonna throw David Cronenberg into the mix of this a little bit. And we'll talk about some other things. I'm sure there'll be some stuff we didn't quite or talk about as much as we'd like. But that's another not an American specifically, but close enough for our.
And how do they get the After Dark, Brad?
They get that at patreon.com/artofdarkpod, where you can get 20 to 30 minute After Dark episodes for every episode we do, and the book club.
Yes, and you're going to want to do that. We are trying to make half a Crowley this year. 333 patrons. We're chugging away.
We're getting there.
So good. This is fascinating. And of course, we're so far removed, I would say, in polite society and modern contemporary society from these ideas, David. But then again, we also aren't. I mean, you can go online and find all of this happening right now if you click the third link. And it's nice to try to imagine that this doesn't still exist, but of course it does. And people are extremely terrified to talk about these subjects, and maybe for good reason. It provokes a lot of very strong feelings. As then, still now.
Yeah. And I think it's crucial. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I wanted to read a particularly Faulknerian Lovecraft passage for people who maybe are listening to this who are Faulkner heads, but haven't quite stepped into Lovecraft. See, Lovecraft gets
I'm trying to imagine I love this episode already because certified banger it's going to be. I can feel it because we're trying to make a Venn diagram where you might not think one would exist. That's exciting.
What I think we're finding is it's actually big. Like the center is actually, there's a lot going on in the middle of it. And so, and the thing that happens with Lovecraft is I think a lot of people who, how to say this as diplomatically as possible. I think a lot of people are able to sort of dismiss Lovecraft in their head because he's not only for the racist stuff, and we talked about that at length in our core episode, but also because he falls into the speculative realm, right? Lovecraft's not writing realistic stuff, and there are still a contingent of people for whom that stuff isn't somehow serious. And I think I want to throw this passage out there for a person who's a real Faulkner head. Listen to this and tell me this isn't sort of like Absalom. Okay, this is from the Dunwich Horror. And it's just a couple paragraphs, but it'll go quick. For a decade, the annals of the Whateleys sink indistinguishably into the general life of a morbid community used to their queer ways and hardened to their May Eve and All Hallows orgies. Twice a year, they would light fires on the top of Sentinel Hill, at which times the mountain rumblings would recur with greater and greater violence. While at all seasons, there were strange and portentous doings at the lonely farmhouse. In the course of time, callers professed to hear sounds in the sealed upper story, even when all the family were downstairs, and they wondered how swiftly or how lingeringly a cow or bullock was usually sacrificed. There was talk of a complaint to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, but nothing ever came of it, since Dunwich folk are never anxious to call the outside world's attention to themselves. They don't want to. About 1923, when Wilbur was a boy of 10, whose mind, voice, stature, and bearded face gave all the impressions of maturity, a second great siege of carpentry went on at the old house. It was all inside the sealed upper part, and from bits of discarded lumber, people concluded that the youth and his grandfather had knocked out all the partitions and even removed the attic floor, leaving only one vast open void between the ground story and the peaked roof. They had torn down the great central chimney, too, and fitted the rusty range with a flimsy outside tin stovepipe. In the spring after this event, old Whately noticed the growing number of whippoorwills that would come out of Cold Spring Glen to chirp under the window at night. He seemed to regard the circumstance as one of great significance and told the loungers at Osborne's that he thought his time had almost come. Right? To me, it doesn't quite have the Faulknerian flourish in terms of syntax, but that is how Faulkner might set something up. I think of A Rose for Emily. It's a lot about like what's going on inside that house and nobody's quite sure, but everybody sort of knows, and it ties into various traditions and histories of the area. And there's not a character, you're not focalized in the emotional reality of a specific character. This is all stuff that's happening, right? You can almost hear the voice being we in this case. Like we knew that this, and instead of it being I or just just a third person. So yeah, I read this story and it it made me think. It did. I don't know if I'm going to be able to read a Lovecraft story without hearing Faulkner in it anymore.
You can never unsee it, right? Once it's there, it's there. It's like it's itself a Lovecraftian mind virus.
Yeah.
Well, they were both, of course, would have been steeped in the Bible, and that comes across in the style.
Yeah,
I think one interesting difference that Brad, you kind of alluded to there, part of why Lovecraft is considered tawdrier, or like a bit like people are a little uncomfortable saying he's a good writer. I think Alan Moore has a great line about him when he said, no other writer has ever so over-described the indescribable.
Right.
But I think one reason why that's actually, to me, a little bit poignant is that Lovecraft, was very ambivalent about professionalism, right? On the one hand, he wanted to send his stories to Weird Tales. He wanted to be kind of validated and paid for his work, but he also viewed it as beneath the image of himself as a kind of cultivated gentleman. He was someone who kind of wished he were rich, but wasn't, right? And affected and acted as if he were. And that's a very American thing too, of like, what is class without cash, right? Like in America, you can't really fall back on family name, right?
Yeah.
So what this means is that he was never able to separate his work for pay and his work for art, which means that all of his stories have these kind of strokes of genius within them, or at least his best stories, and this kind of, pulp fiction quality. Whereas Faulkner was much more professional. He had kids, he had mouths to feed, lived a kind of different life. And if you read some of Faulkner's like short stories that he, sold to Life magazine or the Saturday Evening Post, or watch the movies that he wrote, those are pulp. Like those are not that artsy, but it means that Faulkner's novels seem much more highbrow because he separated those two tendencies, whereas Lovecraft combined them.
Yeah. Now that's an interesting contradiction about Lovecraft's life, and I think there's actually some kind of correspondence for me. So one of the mysteries about Lovecraft, or one of the curiosities about him for me, is he wrote these stories. He had dreamlike visions about them as a boy, and had practices in which he was purposely trying to give himself these visions later, different manipulations of how he fell asleep and things like that. And yet, if you were to ask him what his sort of cosmology was, he would say that he didn't believe in any of it. Like, it's not like, according to him, if you were just asking him a conversation, it's not like he believed Cthulhu was out there somewhere, right? This is all just fancy. But there's I don't know that if I believe him. Like, I think he did at some level believe this stuff was maybe not the specifics, maybe not exactly Cthulhu, and but I think he had to have bought into this on some level. What do you make of that?
I think there's an interesting thing. This book called The Conspiracy Against the Human Race by Thomas Ligotti.
Yeah, I haven't read it. I want to, but I know I'm aware of it.
But his basic take on it is that Lovecraft truly internalized the ideas of Einstein and like really understood what Einstein was getting at about the cosmos and how sort of vast and complex and perhaps godless the universe was. And yet perhaps Lovecraft internalized it so deeply that it did dislodge whatever kind of lingering Christianity he had, but then something else rushed to fill the vacuum, right? And he did populate it with these almost like neo-pagan gods, and he might claim not to believe in them, but as he sort of perceived them in a way that is deeper than belief, which actually is what his characters do too, right? His characters don't. Part of what's interesting about the stories is that they don't hinge on belief, right? They're not like older supernatural tales where it's like, do you believe in vampires? Do you believe in werewolves? They're just presented as a material fact, but it's so overwhelmingly real, it almost makes everything else that you thought was real look like a matter of belief.
Oh yeah, no, you're right. You're actually confronted with the actual thing, and thereby, like, you're right, it doesn't matter. he somehow transcends the notion of whether you believe it or not, right? Yeah,
100%.
very interesting.
Totally.
There isn't a moment either, I don't think. It's been a long time since I've read Lovecraft. Brad covered him on our core episode, which if you haven't heard, you ought to go back and listen to it after you listen to this Darkroom episode. But there isn't a case that I recall, having read his work, where someone grabs a crucifix and gets themselves out of it, or prays and gets, invokes the name of Jesus Christ or whatnot. No,
there's no getting out of it, Kevin.
There's no getting out of it. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important question, going back to this idea of what makes them deeply American, is they both wrestle with this question of like, is America a Christian nation or not, in a really deep way? And they have different answers, right? That Lovecraft says no, but his version of atheism is pretty pantheistic.
Right.
And Faulkner might say yes. I mean, Faulkner's work is much more explicitly Christian, but it's sort of like, what is Christianity when it's this far from Rome, let's say, or from, whatever the centers of Protestantism would be, maybe London, right? That it's like, what does Christianity look like in backwoods Mississippi? And like, can it be, you see this in Latin American literature too, right? But it's like, can it be reinvented in some form that makes it relevant to a new place and a new paradigm? Or is it just this kind of like clinging to, these meaningless symbols of the cross and whatever that aren't going to do anything against the demons that actually live here?
Yeah, that's interesting. And it calls to mind, reading accounts from like sort of the 1600s and things of settlers here who came here, God-fearing Christians, but noticed how more amenable the geography and and wildlife and everything were to the natives. And some of the Europeans basically said, yeah, our gods don't live here. Like, our God doesn't live here. Like, it's their God is way stronger here than ours is, right? All your people are dying of diseases. You don't even have a theory of what a disease is, and they're all fine and managing to scrape together what seems like an abundant lifestyle out of this land that's killing you, right? It would be interesting. That's a test of faith for sure, right? And these people believe in like, who knows what. You probably can't even understand it, let alone, understand the language, let alone really grok what their cosmology is. Yeah.
And that's a big part of Sutben in Absalom too, right? That he has some kind of like alliances with the native tribes in Mississippi that have somehow made him more powerful than the somewhat easy to take advantage locals who like don't seem to understand the world that they're in.
Right.
And it's part of
Sutpen understands what the game is better than other people, doesn't he? Yeah.
Yeah. And he listens, right? It's like this combination of, he's more arrogant and more domineering than everyone else, but he also understands what's actually happening. He's not lost in a kind of dream of another time. He's like his eyes are on the future. He's a man on the make, like the Snopes, who are insidious forces. But I think Faulkner kind of, I don't know if he admires them, but he recognizes why they're powerful within this kind of free-for-all culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, America rewards those kinds of people for good or ill.
Totally.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that, at the risk of sounding like a fanboy and bringing it up too frequently, I don't think it doesn't come up on every episode, but fair to say in the glass bead game sense, is the perfect marriage of the Faulknerian and the Lovecraftian True Detective season 1? Are we
which is the Legatian, right? I mean, Legati himself, fused those two things, and then it perfectly found its place in that very rare season, never to be repeated.
Yeah. And you brought up an interesting point in the notes about The Passenger, about Cormac McCarthy's latest, maybe his last contributions, The Passenger and Stella Maris. To me, they're almost one book in a way, and they're interlinked. What's Lovecraftian about The Passenger? What's Faulknerian about it? How is it in this Venn diagram we've built?
It's also very True Detective-esque because it takes place on that sort of swampy Gulf Coast of northern Florida and Louisiana. So, the connection between Faulkner and McCarthy is more direct, right? I think McCarthy even inherited Faulkner's editor when Faulkner died. So there was this sort of handoff.
Erskine,
who was sort of like, who was going to be the great, chronicler of almost like Old Testament reckoning in the American backwoods, right? I mean, that's clear what that means. The Lovecraftian aspects of McCarthy are always there. You can see it in Child of God for sure. He's kind of like a Dunwich horror guy. But to stick with The Passenger, I think you see this sense of like ancient monsters, right? Or this just like, McCarthy often calls it like a medicine show, right? Or some kind of like freak show of these like ragtag circus beings that he calls the horts, like the cohorts, I guess, in The Passenger, that seem to come out of some realm that is always on the edge of being psychological, right? So like, I guess this is kind of a spoiler, but he does something really interesting in The Passenger where this, ramshackle group of various like flipper armed monstrous beings appear.
The thalidomide kid.
The thalidomide kid.
Among them. Yeah.
Yeah. Appear first mostly to Alicia, the sister of the main character, who's in this asylum called Stella Maris. And so they're presented as like projections of her psyche. And that might be what a more conventional author would stick with. And you could have this one-to-one projection. But then the thing that makes McCarthy so interesting is halfway through the book, he has these same creatures appear to her brother, who's nowhere near the asylum. And that's like the Lovecraftian thing of like the psychological and the ontological are maybe much closer together than we'd like to think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the work of David Lynch too, of course.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. There's something that just feels so right and true about this in the Americas.
And they have Lynch too, has the same tension in like what kind of guy he is, I think, between a certain conservatism or like a yearning toward, the good old days. And, he always wants to call himself an Eagle Scout, right? And his thing about being from, Missoula, Montana, and this kind of like, his obsession with the Wizard of Oz. And I don't mean a political conservatism, but just like a yearning for simpler, older times. But also this kind of like wild embrace of something that feels like newer than the new, like something that feels like it's beyond time, or that's something that they're kind of, I think it's what makes all those artists interesting. It's like there's some genuine friction going on in their psyche, that they're not just like gee whiz, like fanboys of like the way maybe a lot of sci-fi writers are, nor are they like genuine reactionaries like Dostoevsky or Welbeck. Like they're somewhere in between in a way that just sparks something like very strange, because I think it's,
Yeah. I mean, and how does the great season 3 of Twin Peaks, possibly the end of Twin Peaks, what's the last line? I think it's, what year is this? And we struggle with
what's
that
my age again?
Yeah.
Right. We struggle with that in America. We really do.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's exactly it. That's part of what makes them, Faulkner and Lovecraft so interesting, is that they were unsettled, in terms of like their sense of where are we going in time and where are we going in space. I mean, a major similarity, maybe one of the most concrete that we haven't brought up yet, is they had this very similar way of being like homegrown autodidacts, right? And like always living in one place, not a center of power, being like hyper self-educated, but I don't think either of them graduated high school. And having this, like, that's, I think, also a very American thing of like the world's your oyster, but there's no rules, there's no format, like there's no real curriculum, and they just absorbed all this stuff. And then in terms of space, it's a similar thing, that on the one hand, they're like hyper local in this kind of self-imposed reclusive way, like Emily Dickinson. But at the same time, they're talking about like the universe, like they're talking about way more space than, John Steinbeck or Dos Passos or someone who's a more terrestrial writer would be talking about.
Yeah, right. There's something about like, if you just stay in this one spot and you keep digging right there, maybe you'll get to it. Yeah.
It's like you have to give up the world for the sake of the universe.
Right. Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. There's a spot in Stella, I think it's in Stella Maris, but it might be in The Passenger, where Alicia refers to, I should have pulled this up. I didn't know if we would get to this or not, but to dumb it down, there's basically this Alicia does math to the point that she sees past math, and there are monsters out there, like huge scaled monsters that she is somewhat terrified of. And that to me is like this Lovecraftian thing as well. Like the fact that like you start with this set of rules that seems seems systematized and systematizable. Seems like it can be optimized. Seems like it can be understood and grokked. And then the further you, the more the resolution amps up, if you can handle it, what you realize is what that's attempting to describe is something completely indescribable, right?
And
so
maybe
it's like, yeah, go ahead.
I know McCarthy talks about Kurt Gödel too, right? And the idea of like incompleteness, or the sense that no matter what you study, you'll eventually see through it to the universe, right? To the scaly monsters. And that maybe, I don't know if Lovecraft was reading Gödel, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was. It was the same time period. But whether or not he was, that's definitely true of Lovecraft, that I think it's like another anxiety, the same way he has this anxiety about, wanting to be a man of the world and wanting to like hide in his aunt's attic, right? And like he has both of those at once, similar anxiety, that you see in his characters too, that they're so desperate for knowledge, right? And they're so kind of like earnest and even naive in their desire to know. But they also know, I think they do come to understand before it happens, that the ultimate reward for knowledge is having your mind blown in a horrible way.
That is the trade-off, right? That all information, if you drill down far enough, is an info hazard. Right.
Yeah, and you just can't take, he even says that, right? That's the famous line of Call of Cthulhu, right? That like the greatest gift ever given to mankind is the inability to correlate the contents of our mind. And if we ever became able to correlate them all into a complete picture, he says something like, we would go mad forever or retreat into a new dark age.
I think
if that's not a prophecy of the internet.
Yeah, that's just what I was going to say. So how does social media make you feel? Do you wish we could put that genie back in the bottle? Sometimes. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And I think Faulkner, to kind of tie Faulkner into this, I mean, I think, and I can never say the name of the county, right?
Yoknepatalfa.
Okay, great. We had our friend Aaron Gwynn on to do it. He didn't even think about it. He said it perfect.
It sounds like a Cthulhu monster.
It does sound like a Cthulhu,
and it's a made up word, right? It's a
made up word. It is like glossolalia. You could just go yeah. But there is something, and I found this interesting thinking about Faulkner. Apparently, later on in his life, Faulkner got a little bit confused about the names he had used and what character had been in what book. And there is something about, like, you imagine him sitting down envisioning this entire fictional community that is a sort of a stand-in for how he sees where he's from. And the idea that he keeps building it, and then at some point it sort of breaches containment and begins to become incoherent. Like this attempt he's going to corral this thing, but eventually it can't actually be maintained. And now you've got people in the wrong parts of their story and people with different names. Like that almost feels Lovecraftian in and of itself, that whole process, that just like you're going to carry this thing out, and at the end of it, it's mutated, it's monstrous, it's got two heads on one body and that sort of thing. Very interesting.
And it goes back to their racial obsessions too, that I think like the thing that makes that more than just a like atavism is that it's so deeply rooted within the characters, because the characters in Lovecraft and Faulkner always want to understand their own genealogy. And they always suspect that if they trace it back far enough, they're going to find people breeding with rats or with sea monsters, or it's just always going to be the case.
Right. There's always this like contamination. And for Faulkner, it's very much about, is it Light in August? That's very much about whether or not he has a drop of black blood. Right. And
Joe Christmas, right?
Christmas,
JC, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, JC. And Faulkner himself had anxieties about that based on things that had happened in his family, right? Yeah.
As do all Americans. I mean, in a way, you could say that's our source of strength, but it's like what makes us not just culturally, but perhaps somewhat racially different than wherever we think we started from in Europe. Even if you view yourself as European, your sense of what your history has these kind of mysteries in it that may be one of the best things about America, right? But it's like, people like Lovecraft and Faulkner, they did definitely perceive it in a negative way, but they also perceived the power of it, the sense that it was meaningful, that it mattered, what blood was in this way that, was partially just the times, but I think partially resonates today, maybe in an uncomfortable sense, but it gets at something of like this mystery of, who are you really and how much do you really know and how much do you want to know?
Yeah, the great severing of the crossing of the ocean and how your people came in
Right.
all directions. And David Mamet has a line about America in one of his books. He said something about that. Like, I can't remember the exact line, but it's like the unhappy truth of our origins or something like that. People didn't come over here because things were going well. Many were dragged over here. Rather notably, it's quite intense and traumatic to think about.
Many escaped to hear like a house. You escape a house on fire,
And
right?
they still are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is the story. We are living in it. History didn't end. Yeah. Very interesting.
Right. No, and you see that in both of them too. This idea of being like, there's a beautiful line at a professor in college who was teaching a Faulkner course, and he said, I think Faulkner actually said this, or maybe this is just this guy's take on it, but he said, Faulkner aspired to write as if the begats of the Old Testament hadn't ended, but had continued in Mississippi.
I love that.
Wow.
He does have moments where he is striving for the feel of a book of the Bible, doesn't he? Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a kind of insane ambition that is part of what makes American literature to me really vibrant, to go back to Melville. But it's like there's this wild, I read this book once about, American like religious extremism, and it was talking about Joseph Smith and Mormonism, and it said, there's been endless people writing exegeses on the Bible and, talking about different things throughout the world, but only in America do you get one guy who's like, I'm just writing a new book of the Bible. Like,
right.
I'm adding this to the Bible.
That is a particularly, well, it seems to be a kind of a particularly American thing, right? And I mean, you talked about the severing of the traveling across the Atlantic. I mean, that does make sense. We can't not live with our myths and stories and lineages. We can't, we're gonna make them up if we don't, if they're not granted to us, right? Yeah,
right. I mean, that's my newest novel. It's called The New House, which basically is this story from a Jewish perspective. And it's sort of this Jewish family who are seeking the new Jerusalem within America, and there's this obsession that it has to be here. Like, it can't be Israel. Israel's like a lost cause, right? It has to be. The vision has to occur in America, or it's over. There is no more vision.
Yeah.
But that tension is really interesting to me, and that's sort of, I kind of feel that way, that there's just like, you can't, the old world is kind of a lost cause in some sense. Like, there is some sense that whatever the problems of America are, they have to be maybe not solved, but it's like their energies you have to ride out those energies to the final reckoning, whatever it's going to be.
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you what it's like to grow up Catholic in America, because the dissonance is real. Yeah. And it's interesting. It only becomes more acute as I age. I just see the differences more, and I've become more active in the church here recently, but also just when you grow up in it, in this country, it's very odd. Creates an odd kind of schism in the psyche, let's just say. Yeah.
Right. No, it's interesting. We just read A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, the Garcia Marquez story, who's another, had a kind of mutual influence on Faulkner, and did a very similar thing, right, of creating a universe in his hometown and inventing Macondo as this kind of fantasy version of a town in what was otherwise described pretty accurately as Colombia. But you have that same anxiety where like an angel washes up in this town in Colombia, or at least a man with wings who they think is an angel, but no one in the town can decide, or at least no one can agree. And someone's like, look, let's write to Rome. And maybe they'll send a bishop who will come and tell us if it's a real angel or not. Right. But it's that exact thing, that somehow the like authority to be certain is not vested anywhere in the New World.
Yeah. Interesting.
But the place where a real angel would appear is here, is not Rome.
Right. Interesting. I'm not familiar. I have not read that Marquez piece.
It's like 4 pages. It's called A Tale for Children. I don't know if you really meant it to be a tale for children, but it is called that.
Interesting. Well, as we're getting kind of close to the end here, David, sell us on, you've sold me on it already, but sell the audience, sell Kevin on the Room in Dodge City trilogy.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tie it into these guys. So
okay, great.
They wrote their pieces in the super, super intense 10-year period, right? 1927 to 1937, which was, and I would say they're two of my favorite authors. Two of my other favorite authors, Jewish authors, would be Kafka and Bruno Schulz. And Bruno Schulz, Street of Crocodiles, did literally the same thing in Poland, of creating this kind of like infinite universe in a town. Right, his town's called Drohobych, which is a real town, but I doubt it has a street of crocodiles in it. Right, so I mean, there's there are fantasy elements within it, and I think that kind of genre slippage was just like really hyper valuable to me as like a 17 through 25-year-old. And the idea that, I knew I wasn't interested in outright fantasy, things that, were sealed off in another world with another name, just didn't really speak to me. But I also wasn't that drawn toward realism. And so I think something about, you could call these guys magical realists in a way, but the idea of setting fantastical and bizarre and kind of dreamlike and perverse and maybe darkly hilarious events in a real place, I somehow needed that in order to like open up the whole vista that I was going to work on. And so my first novel is called Angel House, that I wrote right after this like just obsessive Faulkner phase. So it was probably my most Faulknerian novel. It's kind of me trying to do a version of Jefferson in Northampton. So it's like me taking my childhood memories, but turning like some of the feelings that I had as a child into genuine situations that I could describe as an adult. And then out of that, this, what is now a Dodge City trilogy, Room in Dodge City trilogy, kind of grew out of that project. Sometimes literally, it was like actual stuff that I cut, and then it developed in its own way. And they're kind of part of the same project. And I sort of have this life goal of creating like an actual nested fictional universe that is like overlaid onto the world map. So I have, different books that take place in different, sometimes imagined places, but sometimes real places like Dodge City. I treat it like the actual Dodge City. And my wife is from Kansas. I spent a lot of time in Kansas. Although I went to the Kansas Book Festival a couple of years ago, and they asked me, had I been to Dodge City? And I said, I've made a point of going to every town in Kansas except Dodge City.
You got to keep that. You got to keep the imagined version of it pristine. I get that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
now that I've finished number 3, when it comes out, like when the third one's not out yet, but when it's out, I think maybe then I'll go to Dodge City and I'll leave like the trilogy like on a doorstep somewhere or something.
Yeah, there you go.
Put it in one of those little giveaway little book boxes.
Yeah. Or maybe with like the brochures and like the Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah. Oh, this is the book. These are the books about Dodge City. Yeah, you got to check those out. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, David, where can people find you? We'll put a link to your Twitter handle in the show notes. Where can people find you?
So everything is under Ravid Dice, which is just like David Rice, but with the first letter switched. So on Twitter, it's at Ravid Dice, right? RAVIDDICE. On Instagram, same thing, Ravid Dice. And my website that has links to everything is just raviddice.com.
Great.
Love it. Yeah.
Brad, thank you so much for organizing this. What are we going to talk about on the After Dark for Patreon, patreon.com/artofdarkpod?
Yeah, we're gonna throw David Cronenberg in the mix because David has put out a book about David Cronenberg, and I think there's correspondences. I think we're gonna find there's some fertile territory there, and we're also going to talk about Lovecraft actually wrote in letters what his opinion of Faulkner was. And so we're going to talk about that as well. We're going to quote those letters and talk about that.
Listen, I don't want to give the sales pitch too hard for this, but if you like this pod, you don't want to miss the After Darks. We save the juicy stuff for that. We get juicy on Maine too. Yeah. Fair to say.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
Please, we put a lot of work into this show. Patreon.com/artofdarkpod. I'm going to go downstairs during this quick break. Well, go ahead, Brad.
Well, I was going to say, don't forget the Bookends Reading Club. Next up is the Essential Emily Dickinson. We're reading, I think it's about 100 pages of Emily Dickinson's poems, and we're going to hang out. We're going to talk about them. I've got some ideas. Kevin's going to have some ideas, and you all will have some ideas. They're a good time.
And Brad is preparing Dickinson right now, and I'm preparing Bukowski.
Charles Bukowski, right.
So we're going to have Salt and Pepper in the house.
The two poles of American poetry.
East Coast versus West Coast and more. Super exciting. I was just going to say during the break here, I'm going to go down into the basement and make sure that the unspeakable thing has not broken its chains and its shackles. I need to make sure it's still locked up down there in its cage. Wish me luck, boys.
Good luck, sir.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. This is fun.
All right. See you in a minute.